Well, this morning on Media and Society, we observe Black Wednesday. It's 45 years since Black Wednesday, and we discuss the strides and challenges faced by South Africa's journalists today. We expand the discussion then to the rest of the continent. We discuss media freedom across the African continent. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on Media and Society. My name is Naledi Mula, with you until 10 o'clock this morning. Now, of course, this is the show that looks at the role that the media plays in your lives, and it's also a platform for you to get in touch with us and tell us how you feel about what we feed you as the media. And of course, get onto Twitter, share your thoughts with us by using the hashtag Media Society or giving us a call on 011-714-0661 throughout this hour as we unpack the discussions of the strides made in media freedom in South Africa and on the continent over the next hour.
There is media freedom in South Africa because we have different platforms that people can use. We have social media, we have television, we have newspapers, we have radios. So people are able to use those platforms to communicate, to express their opinions.
There is media freedom in South Africa. Come to look at it, journalists and their media houses, are free to report on any subject they want, and they are free to criticize on any questions, even to the leading politicians. And there is no censorship.
For the past maybe 5 years, you can't just share anything. A lot of people have been getting into trouble because they shared their true opinions, especially issues that concern politics or issues that can make people question the leadership of our country.
In a democratic country, South Africa, the media freedom is granted by the Constitution. However, is not absolute, as there's a threat against the media by the politician and the government, where they want less critiques and the media to be patriotic to their report about the government and the politician.
Since the attainment of our freedom and democracy in 1994, we have never had any media freedom in this country. In my classical Marxist analysis, I know for a fact that information is driven by the upper class.
Yes, I think there's media freedom in South Africa. But the only challenge is that there's a lot of fake news, misinformation, data manipulation. So as a result, I think there must be some regulations in the media environment.
So as we observe a Black Friday, let's take you down the path of history, actually. On the 10th of October 1977, the World newspaper and its weekend publication was shut down by the apartheid government. The editor, Percy Qoboza, and others were arrested and kept behind bars for 5 to 6 months without trial. Well, the day is today called Black Wednesday, or National Press Freedom Day, and those are some of the views of the viewers and South Africans on whether or not they think South Africa has achieved media freedom. Well, to take this discussion forward, we're joined by the Government Communications Information Services, or GCIS, that has been hosting a series of events, including a webinar around Black Wednesday, which is this coming Wednesday on the 19th of October. There'll also be a Media Freedom Festival. Give us a call, 011-714-0661 or 0662. Again, that Twitter hashtag is hashtag SABC Media and Society. So let's get into this morning's discussion to talk a little bit about what happened in 1977 and what we've learned about the importance of media freedom up until 2022. I am joined via Zoom by Mr. William Baloyi, who is the Chief Director of Media Engagement at GCIS. I am also joined by Sowetan editor and also SANEF Deputy Chair, Mr. Nwabisa Makungu. Thank you so much for joining us, Nwabisa and William. An absolute pleasure having you. I think, William, I want to start with you, and it's an interesting opportunity for us, I guess, to go right back into history, right, and go back all the way to 1977 and what that moment on the 10th of October 1977 was, and why it was such a catalytic moment for South Africa.
No, thank you very much, and thank you also to the viewers at home. From government side, I think we realize that media freedom is an integral part of our democracy. And the architects of our democratic dispensation insisted that media freedom be a fundamental feature of our new society. And now we realize that today, media play a very important role in entrenching our constitution and also playing an essential part in building a society. Hence, as government, we took a decision through also GCIS that in celebrating National Media Freedom Day, we want to honor the work of our nation's media, and especially to this year as it marks 45 years of the anniversary of Black Wednesday, as you have also articulated, when the apartheid regime unleashed its brutal force, against the press. And we are saying no longer would we have a situation, especially in this new dispensation, where the freedom of press is curtailed. And we joined the thousands of journalists, not only in South Africa, but also in the world, in celebrating this milestone of making sure that communities, the societies are well informed and have access to information.
Yeah, I do want to sit on the history of it for a little bit, William, and I'll bring you in when Nobisa as well, right? And I understand that obviously government wants to hit its targets in the discussion, but can we just also inform and educate the viewer about why we even celebrate this day and why it was such an important day for South African history, especially in Nobisa?
Hi, Naledi, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's really an important day. I mean, many of the viewers would have read, those who are probably much younger, in 1977, when the apartheid government banned newspapers and arrested journalists and editors, and also like-minded sort of organizations that were really fighting against that regime. And I think that at the time it had been long coming. If you understand the context of the apartheid system at the time, journalists were very much seen and editors were very much seen as the enemies of the regime. And they were, righteously so, they were enemies of the regime because they really exposed, the atrocities that happened at the time. So when that order came and, editors were arrested and newspapers were banned, it was really the apartheid government, exerting its force and shutting down really a pillar of society, which is in the flow of information and people and the right of people to know. Not only were they
Okay, there seems to be something wrong with the line there.
I'm getting terrible feedback. I apologize.
Okay, it stopped then, Nobisa, you can carry on.
Thank you. So I was just saying, not only were they, reinforcing their power, but abusing their power essentially, but they were also, sending a very strong message to society at large that we can do whatever we want, and look at these people who perhaps may have thought that they're untouchable and that they're your voice. We can actually target them and we can actually, do as we please. And I think, William is correct to say that it's a time that we ought to look back at and really think about how do we learn from that as we commemorate it, but really think about what has changed, how far we've come since then.
Yeah. I want to sit a little bit on the timing of 1977 and the origins of Black Wednesday for South Africa, William, because if you look at it, 1977, the year after 1976, during that period, even in 1977, you had young people, young South Africans who were scattering into different parts of the continent, into different parts of the world. It was as a result of the June 16 riots. It was a hot and very dangerous time to be in South Africa. There was also the very beginning of television, really, at around that time as well in the country. So one could only imagine the atmosphere in the country when journalists were telling these stories and they had these growing platforms, right? I mean, let's talk a little bit about why it was, I suppose, so intimidating for the apartheid government in that era to have journalists that were doing their job.
No, thank you very much. I think perhaps it's quite important to also note that during that era, the repressive apartheid regime didn't want a society to be informed. Hence, they were quite hard on the media. But very interesting part of it is that by that time, I think the media took a conscious decision that what was happening in this country was not proper. People were being made and killed. And they took a conscious decision that we are going to inform the world, but also we are going to inform South Africans as a whole of what the situation was like. Hence, they were a problem to the then repressive regime. Hence, they went hard on them. But quite interesting, as we speak even today, we still have pictures of what happened during apartheid. Where did we get those pictures? It was because of the role of the media. We are able to today tell the stories of how worse the regime was. The whole world came to condemn the system of apartheid. Why? Because through the media, they were able to have a bird's eye view, but also direct information of what actually is happening in South Africa.
Yeah.
And that is why we have taken that decision as government, that we are going to safeguard the role of the media in making sure that we have a well-informed society. And the media, if I have to be honest with you, are a window through which a society can view itself. The media is also a mirror through which a society can look at itself and say, things are not going as we want, or there are certain corners of our country and our society where things are not going right. That is the most important role that the media plays.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think about when I reflect on where South African media comes from pre-1994 is certainly this idea that you had journalists across racial lines, Nwabisa, in a lot of spaces really wanting to tell the story of how atrocious the apartheid government was, that it was a very united front. I mean, is that the sense that you get about where we were pre-1994 with media in South Africa?
Yes, it's slightly complex, I think. So you had journalists who were very much opposed to the regime, and you correctly, as you say, across racial lines. I mean, some of the people who perhaps mentored me, in this journey of journalism were some of those people, who of all races, of all cultures, who really stood in the front line telling the South African story. But you also had, and as I suppose this is not unique to South Africa, throughout the world, you also had those journalists who were sympathetic to the regime and essentially put out the propaganda of the regime. So, you had, kind of equally, journalists who were doing their work, but really for different reasons, in our opinion.
Yeah, and that's where I want to take it next, I think, right? Let's take a short break. When we come back, let's talk a little bit about where we are now, right? Are South African journalists telling the story that they should be telling about the current state of our country? And do you have those that, like Nwabisa says, are really still quite sympathetic? We'll get into the discussion on how a Black Wednesday impacts current storytelling after this. Welcome back. Well, you're still watching Media and Society. Remember, you can be part of the program as well by giving us a call on 011-714-0661 or 0662. And the question we're asking you this morning is, has South Africa learned from the history of a Black Wednesday when journalists were thrown into prison for simply doing their work? Have we learned our lesson? I'm still in conversation with Mr. William Baloyi, Chief Director of Media Engagement at GCIS, as well as Sowetan editor and Sane IMF Deputy Chair, Nwabisa Makungu. Well, let's get into where we are now, Ndata William. And I bring you in here and I say, okay, so we've learned the lessons of where we come from 45 years ago, but where do we stand right now in terms of media freedom in South Africa? I mean, from the bird's eye view that you have at GCIS, do you see a media that is operating at the level that it should be?
Naledi, thank you very much for that question. I think as my fellow participant, Nwabisa, has indicated that in the past, some journalists, obviously, through the state-controlled media, had to play a particular role. I think what it brings into perspective now is the tricky and dangerous terrain that journalists find themselves in. And it's a thankless job, if I have to indicate. But also it espouses a commitment to a just cause. So as South Africa, we feel, and especially this government, that we have done everything possible to make sure that there is a media freedom. And that, I think, is based on our history, where we come from, and we have learned, and we have taken a conscious decision that never and never again would we subject information to be manipulated. Would we subject our society not to have free access to the media? And up to thus far, we have demonstrated clearly by making sure that it is a constitutional right. We do have a freedom of expression in South Africa. We have also freedom of the media that it's entrenched in our media. So, and we have put in place instruments.
Except, Mr. Baloyi, and I'm going to step in here, right? Except that just this week, we saw a journalist in the dock in a courtroom. And her argument, I'm talking now about Karen Moore, in a private prosecution by a former president who essentially feels that she is being intimidated and being stopped from doing her job. So can we really say that we have that media freedom that we're talking about when just this week the whole country was looking at that image of a journalist in the dock in a courtroom?
That's a very important thing that will then bring into perspective the freedoms that South Africans enjoy. The Bill of Rights articulates the building of an open and inclusive information society. And our Bill of Rights guarantees the right of freedom of expression as enshrined in our Constitution. I think it's Section 66 of the Constitution, but also Section 66.1 guarantees that every person has the right to freedom of expression, which includes, of course, freedom of the press and other media, freedom to receive or impart information or ideas, freedom also of artistic creativity, academic freedom, and freedom of scientific research. But at the same time, every human being in our country is also guaranteed the freedom to be free, to take whatever course that they have.
Yeah.
So that is a balancing thing. You have freedom of expression, but also the Bill of Rights does guarantee each and every citizen a right when you are aggrieved to have a process. Hence, we have the courts as the arbiters, that if I feel wrong, therefore the courts will arbiter. So I think the case in question is a test case to not only the journalistic art in South Africa or the media, but also to us as general. But the good side of it is that it shows that as a country, we have progressed so much that each and everyone practically have a right to practice that which is within the ambit of the law.
Well, I mean, it certainly is one thing to go and look at the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I mean, we know that as South Africans, we really are quite good at writing legislation, but I suppose it will come from the journalists whether or not we're seeing that in practice, right? William essentially saying that, look, our Constitution gives you as a journalist the freedom to write what you will. But those who feel aggrieved may take you to court. We saw the case of Karen Moore in the dock this week, in the country, glued to that story. When you looked at that image of her in a courtroom, did you think that we have media freedom in the country?
Naledi, this question. I think, let me answer it this way, kind of contextually. I think when we talk about media freedom, we need to really, be able to contextualize what we actually mean. So there is media freedom as far as I, as a journalist, can publish, information as I see it, etc., using obviously all the tools of analysis that we have. So we can do that. Nobody stops us from doing that, even though they may try. So that is one part of media freedom. However, what we've seen increasingly, and not uniquely to South Africa, but also throughout the world, what we've seen increasingly is the consequence of doing that. And I think when we analyze what media freedom is, we must never only look at the fact that, oh, well, you do have the platform and therefore you are able to do your job, but also look at what may be the consequence of doing that, particularly from those who claim to feel aggrieved, right? Where essentially in South Africa and suppose elsewhere in the world, it is really those who don't want to be held accountable for their actions. And I think in analyzing, so when I saw that visual of Karen Moore, it really, for me, put into sharp focus the fact that, yes, of course, she was able to publish the story that she did, doing something that journalists, by the way, do every single day, where we get court papers and publish them. But what the consequence of that, from a person who says that they're aggrieved, and we can always argue the facts. We believe that his facts are absolutely wrong. What she did is really publish information that was filed in court, and it's what journalists pretty much do every day. He says, well, my records, medical records, there were no medical records. It was a letter saying that why he couldn't go to court. But nonetheless, a judge, suppose, will look at all those merits and really, tell us, and we'll see what the court determines as far as that is concerned. But media freedom in itself is not only about having access to a platform and publishing, it is also about what happens in South Africa. And the reason, and what does happen is that journalists are basically harassed and very violated and abused because of what they write. And I don't think that that is media freedom at all. When we do wrong, of course, there are platforms of recourse that people can seek. But we don't believe that in particular, that Karen Moore case is really about that.
Okay, and then let's talk about the flip end of that discussion, right? And say, well, there certainly is there certainly is merit to the discussion about needing to protect journalists and allowing them to do their job. But there's also the responsibility that journalists should have. Nobis, and I'm going to stay with you on this one before I bring it back to Mr. Baloyi. The responsibility that journalists have themselves to uphold their ethics, right? And I've seen organizations like SANEF come out in defense of journalists when they have been harassed and attacked. But what is the work of SANEF really in ensuring that, well, journalists in and of themselves uphold the ethics that come with the responsibility of being a journalist? I mean, just recently we were covering the story of journalists that were trying to extort money out of a subject that they were going to write a piece about.
Absolutely. So there are multiple things that do happen. So, and we need to, I think, categorize. There's journalists who do wrong, not necessarily because they intend to, but perhaps because they don't know. And I think what we need to do there, which is what we do, is really training, increase the level of training of journalists, because the fact of the matter is there are journalists, many newsrooms are not able to afford that. So we invest a lot in basic training of journalism, training as far as covering courts, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the one part, right? The second part is really about journalists who intend to do wrong. You talk about the case of extortion, etc. And in those cases, I mean, we did engage with Media 24, for example, to say we demand answers. What exactly is going on? What did this journalist do? And all of that. And our job, we see it as really putting pressure on those who are able to, or those who hold power over those journalists. So be it media houses, being editors, to say we need accountability. We need to be able to see what it is that was done, and we need to know ultimately how is it that people are able to account for what they've done. So and it really, the scale varies. I mean, there were journalists, for example, who there was a huge outcry in the country of journalists who went in court covering the Senzo Mayiwa trial, and basically kind of harassed a witness prior to him appearing in court. And we're quite vocal about that to say we absolutely cannot do this because we crossed the line and we know that we're not supposed to do this, and apologies, etc. So I absolutely agree with you, Naledi, as far as, it's not only about us coming out and saying, we're protecting journalists, we're trying to say, hands off journalists who are doing their work, but also it's about us reflecting and looking in and talking to our peers as well as their bosses to say we cannot do this, and it's something that we do quite often. Yes.
Yeah, I think we need to talk over and over again in South Africa about media ethics, and not just for the journalists, but also so that the viewers and the consumers of media know what is expected of us. Mr. Baloyi, just final thoughts from you, and then of course I know you've got quite a busy list of events coming out of GCIS as you celebrate media freedom. Tell us what the plans are.
No, thank you very much, Naledi. Perhaps maybe Naledi to zero in on what my colleague Nwabisa said. I think she has raised quite an important part of our democracy as South Africa. That the trade of journalism versus also the issue of broader media, and also the codes that are there. But the beauty of it, from a South African point of view, is that the government has provided that space, that the ethics, as you're talking about, are within the terrain of the media space, journalism, to say, how do you also put checks and balances for yourselves? How do you make sure that there is self-regulation from your side? So government is not interfering in that. It's saying this is your terrain. And that is the beauty of what our constitution enshrines. And one should also appreciate that the media fraternity in South Africa has been also at the forefront of making sure that there is continuous engagement amongst themselves in terms of saying, are we sticking to this code? And on regular basis, trying to check whether they are proper. And that I think we should appreciate. And coming to the events, I think as government, firstly, let me indicate that in 2002, government established the MTDA, which is a body that, it's responsible for supporting community and small and commercial media. And from that on, what we have done is that we are taking strides to make sure that we safeguard the media. Like, for instance, the MDDA held a consultative conference to consult the sector, in terms of including government and other role players on the strategies that should be put in place to ensure that there is also sustainability of the sector. We know that the sector has been not immune from the challenges, the economic challenges. Some media houses are closing, they're experiencing that. And surely as government, we have asked ourselves, what role do we play? Hence, a minister in the presidency, to show that we take this very seriously from the highest office in the land, had a meeting with some important role players, including your owners in the media. We sat and we look at how do we make sure that we assist the media, and there have been concrete proposals that have been put on the table, and we will be actioning them. And maybe let me also hasten to include that we are also in regular interaction with your bodies like your SANEF, the Press Club, the Press Gallery, Foreign Correspondents Association, Association of Independent Publishers, and your National Community Radio Forum. The aim is to make sure that as enshrines in our constitution, how do we assist to make sure that the media is sustained? Because they are going through the experiences that we have gone through. We are from a devastating COVID era, where they are also affected. And they play quite an important role. I'm running out of time. I have to indicate.
I'm running out of time. Just give us the details of the webinar that you're holding on the 19th.
We had quite a very successful webinar that we had with members of the media, and as government, we are trying to put, to the fore the role that they are playing. But also, it was part of our role in celebrating this month of media freedom, and also to recognize the role that journalists have played and are continuing to play in safeguarding our democracy. So that was our way of showing appreciation also as government on what the media is doing and how important it is.
Okay, so I missed it. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much to Mr. William Baloyi, Chief Director of Media Engagement at GCIS, and of course joining us once again on Media and Society. Always a pleasure having you with us. Nwabi Samakongo, who is the Sowetan editor, but also the deputy chair for SADF, the South African National Editors Forum. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we expand the conversation to what media freedom looks like on the rest of the continent. Stay with us. Welcome back to Media and Society. So, in May this year, the Committee to Protect Journalists said that 11 journalists from independent media had been arrested in Ethiopia. In August, it was reported that Zimbabwean police had arrested journalists Wisdom Zugairi and Desmond Chingarande. In September, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it was reported that journalist Richard Ngoyi had been briefly detained. Well, now Amnesty International says Somalia must release journalist Abdallah Ahmed Mumin, who was recently arrested. Internet shutdowns have also happened in a number of countries in the last decade. These include Zimbabwe, Uganda, Malawi, DRC, Sudan, and many others. And it all points to media freedom being really still a challenge very much on the continent. Militant group Al-Shabaab has warned independent Somali media and journalists against obeying a government directive that banned use of media materials created by the group should be used. It accused the government of attempting to muzzle proponents of the truth. Well, let's take a look at a broader picture of media freedom on the continent.
The government published a list of banned pro-militant websites on Saturday and asked the internet service providers to block them. It also suspended 40 social media accounts that spread Al-Shabaab propaganda and warned Somali journalists that it would regard all Al-Shabaab-related propaganda coverage, including their terrorist acts and their ideology, as punishable crimes. In response, Al-Shabaab issued a statement accusing the government of a campaign to silence the truth. The group also warned internet providers against blocking its affiliated media outlets. Al-Shabaab has a sophisticated media machinery that includes several affiliated media outlets and dozens of accounts across social media platforms. The group's outlets produce a daily mix of audio, text and video material containing the group's activities and messages that are aimed at winning public support.
Well, as we continue to observe Black Wednesday or National Press Freedom Day in South Africa, we extend the conversation to the rest of the continent. And joining us to have that conversation, we are joined by Mr. Samuel Getachew, a freelance journalist who's speaking to us now live from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Samuel, a good morning to you.
Good morning.
We're also joined by Nompilo Simanje, a legal and ICT policy officer at the Media Institute of Southern Africa. Nompilo, a good morning to you, and thank you for your time.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
And a colleague of ours here at the SABC, who's also the head of the Kiswahili service at SABC, is Mr. Nixon Katembo, who's with Channel Africa as well. How are you, sir?
Thanks for having me, and I'm okay today.
Good, very good to have you. A big discussion this, I think, when we talk about Black Wednesday, there's the discussion that we had earlier about how it impacts South Africa. But let's talk about the observation of Media Freedom and Press Freedom Day on the continent. Has there been enough noise about it, Nixon? I'll start with you.
I think from the perspective of the continent, there is still much to be done when it comes to media freedom and the press freedom at large. And it is because of several factors on the continent. One, the media freedom is aligned to either the ruling party in different governments of the country, either the media is used to articulate policies of the government, not necessarily the what you call public media or public radio stations or even television stations to articulate the wishes and aspirations of the people, but rather those in government and in power. So the third aspect, though, is around the issue of talking about what government wish the rest of the world or even the rest of the country to know, and muzzling any other aspect that can be a critical voice in terms of what the government is doing based on its policies and so on. So in countries where, for example, you would find that media is a part, or in other words, the media is embedded in the government programs, where journalists are told to toe the lines, and if they are not, then they get in trouble. Then when we come to other aspects is the issue of private media organization, which perhaps would be owned by certain quarters in the society, advancing certain interests. And therefore, the alignment of journalists in a particular editorial direction will speak to what those aspirations of the founder or even those who have an idea of what they are talking about in terms of expressing their news or their views in terms of that particular society. For example, countries like Equatorial Guinea, you cannot say anything without the government being involved. Otherwise, it has to be the government has done this, the government has done that. Anything that goes against the government, then you are in trouble. Similar cases have been witnessed in Rwanda. Similar cases has been witnessed in Uganda, in Ethiopia, as the package outrightly outlined, and Somalia. So these are the problems that we find on the continent when it comes to media freedom. But also, there are also unconscious biases on the part of journalists in expressing certain writings or even media pieces or news of information that seeks to articulate in certain direction
an
agenda that society have to be.
I think it's interesting that you talk about unconscious biases, and I actually want to sit with that a little bit later on and say, well, is it unconscious, or have we gotten to a point where African journalists themselves think of themselves as political role players, and so perhaps those biases aren't so unconscious after all? But Nompilo, let me bring you in here as MISA, a body that really oversees the work of media across Southern Africa. Where do you see the progress that we've made in terms of the discussion of media freedom, and where are the big gaping holes? And let's be honest about it. Nixon and I were just talking about whether or not we have journalists that are telling the true story, or do they see themselves as political influencers themselves, and that in and of itself influencing the work that they put out?
Thank you very much, Naledi, for this conversation and already for the sentiments that have been shared. As MISA, we appreciate where we are as a continent, particularly in terms of prioritizing media freedom as a constitutional right, as a fundamental right. But what we have raised concern with are laws that come in and that undermine that constitutional right. So already when you look, for example, at cyber laws that are being promulgated, even when you reflect on this year's theme for World Press Freedom Day, journalism under digital siege, we continue to see emerging trends in terms of laws and practices that undermine this constitutional right. And on the aspect of, the issue that you're raising around, unconscious bias,
yes.
I just wanted to reflect that indeed there is some form of media polarization that we are also seeing. Just this morning, we're reading an article that was reflecting on our Cyber and Data Protection Act here in Zimbabwe. And as you're reading that piece of article, you can tell that it's pushing for a certain agenda, because the article was on the criminalization of publishing falsehoods. And you could tell that, this article is trying to justify that criminalizing falsehoods is okay in public interest, but undermining the role that it plays as far as, promoting self-censorship is concerned, as far as unjustifiably infringing on free expression and media freedom is concerned. So we have seen trends in the region that are centered on undermining this constitutional right despite that countries in the region had done well in terms of prioritizing it as a constitutional right and protecting it within the Bill of Rights in the several countries' constitutions. But when it comes to the actual realization of the law and the constitution and that fundamental right, that is where we are lacking, from digital surveillance, from cybersecurity laws, from, media ownership itself. It's influencing also even the nature of information. So media reporting is just no longer about information that is in the public interest. Because of the ownership dynamics, we are seeing also that editorial policies are being influenced, which is why private media is sometimes viewed as pro-opposition or anti-government, and state media is seen as pro-state.
Yeah, let's bank that media ownership part of it, because that's an important one. The owners of the media largely and seemingly are controlling the narrative, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But Samuel, I want to bring you in here. Tell us what's happening in the example of Ethiopia. I mean, when we move up north and we go into closer to the Horn of Africa, are we seeing that media freedom that we're talking about really starting to translate itself on the ground in Ethiopia?
When you say press freedom, I'm sitting here asking what press freedom. Much of the continent doesn't even begin to understand what press freedom is really all about unless you side with either. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm listening, yeah.
You either side with the government mostly. I've been covering the conflicts in Ethiopia. It's been one of the most difficult job I've ever done because much of the country is not accessible to us. The government and the other side keep blaming each other. But what's missing in this conflict of the last 2 years in Ethiopia is not just a lack of freedom, but an understanding that the media should play a role in this continent, recording the history of this country, the history of Africa, and exactly what happened, so people could really understand what's been going on. So in terms of having laws, the continent has one of the most progressive laws in terms of the media, but nobody seems to follow any of those progressive laws. We've seen it in Zimbabwe, we see it in Ethiopia, we see it in much of the country you mentioned. So when you say press freedom, I think most of us are saying what press freedom? It doesn't exist in this part of the continent.
So let me ask you then a further question, because if you're saying, well, what press freedom do you think that the viewers know? If you look at what's happening in Ethiopia, do you think the viewers know that they should be getting more? Is what I'm asking.
Well, many people are focused on social media. We have bloggers. We have paid actors playing the role which professional media should be playing. Our job has been secondary in terms of the distribution of information. Lack of funding is an issue, not just in Ethiopia, across the continent, where much of our professional journalists could be literally paid by somebody to write a story instead of doing what they should be doing. And again, the tragedy of African media is much of the strongest journalists don't live in the continent anymore. Many of them have left. We see them when we travel to other countries. We see them driving taxis. We see them doing, minimal jobs in other countries because they cannot do the kind of journalism that they really want to do in the continent. I don't think there's an appreciation of what the media should be all about in this continent, and that's unfortunate.
I'm thinking about how there are certain parts of our continent where you simply don't hear the stories of what's happening. I mean, if there's a flood in Bujumbura, in Burundi, how often does the rest of the continent know about that? Where are the journalists in Burundi, for instance? And Samuel raising an interesting point, that we're losing a lot of them, right? Are we losing them out of the fear for their safety? Or is it also some of the issues that we bring up here quite often about, well, we're journalists just simply aren't paid enough? I mean, what are the factors that we need to get right to make the lives of journalists easier on the continent, Nixon?
I think the factor of, that needs to be raised is around the issues of work of a journalist and what they contribute to society. their role as a critical part of society in informing what is happening in society. However, on the continent we see that governments attack journalists because of that, raising certain critical issues. For example, in countries like Burundi, you are told what to report on by government official. In Rwanda, similar cases happen. If you so happen to travel to Rwanda, you either have someone not knowingly but following on where you should cover, how you should cover, and what you should report on. In countries like the DRC, it's even attacks. For example, since 2001 up until today, there have been more than 100 attacks on journalists, 4 of which have lost their lives. So these are issues that continue to creep in on the African continent. Just recently in Uganda, there was passed a law called Computer Amendment Act, Computer Misuse Amendment Act, which says to curtail freedom to a certain extent on what journalists write through electronic and print media. So I think we have not appreciated it, as my colleague said in Ethiopia, we have not appreciated the work of journalists. But also it is because of several factors. Sometimes the governments on the continent do not appreciate the role of the media as an important role player in terms of advancing development. But also there are 2 other flip side on the coin. On the other side, you had the influence of the media from the outside. We talked about the ownership of the media. There have been civil society who are funded to actually create community radio stations, which perhaps will not work in line with what the government seeks to portray in the society and the rest of the world, and therefore running into troubles. And those are kind of journalists sometimes who have been forced to flee their countries and find themselves working in the conditions that my colleague have just outlined. So there are a number of issues that we need to think about how the media have to be allowed to perform its duty.
Well, yeah, I'm going to step in just in the interest of time, because Nombila, then I say, then who's there to protect the journalist? I mean, we've got MISA, which is a regional structure of sorts. You've got, similar organizations here in South Africa. But do we have enough of those organizations that are there to protect the voices of journalists? And really, what does that work even entail? What are the successes that you have had?
Yes, thank you very much, Naledi. If I can come to that, if you allow me to just also reaffirm the question of media sustainability that has been raised by colleagues here, because right now we are speaking about the issue of convergence, and the media is also slowly taking up ICTs. You don't only get information from broadcast or from print anymore. The media has had to up its game in order to ensure that consumers receive information, and they receive information that is genuine and factual. But the issue of sustainability is still a key issue that we need to discuss as a region, and make sure that our media institutions think about business models that work in this digital era, and that will ensure that they remain sustainable. Community radios are being set up even here in Zimbabwe, but they are not allowed to advertise. At the same time, they are not allowed to put content that is political. But when you discuss day-to-day real-life issues of communities, for example, even a water crisis or electricity crisis, that can equally qualify as a conversation.
So I'm running out of time, Nombila. So tell me about some of the or at least one successful case that MISA has been able to follow up on and ensure that journalists can do their work.
As MISA, we provide legal support. So for all journalists that have been arrested, including the 2 that you mentioned, we have assigned lawyers from our Media Lawyers Network to attend to those cases. Some cases we have seen to the very end, but for some they are still ongoing. But the support has always been there, together with our local and regional partners.
Okay, and Samuel, before I let you go as well, we're about to wrap up because we're out of time. But I think a call to action really to journalists that are listening and watching across the continent, which is a beautiful thing. We are a Pan-African channel, about the importance of holding on to your integrity even under the pressure that you may be under.
Well, much of the African journalists, including my colleagues, are working as fixers for international media. It reminds me of the old story of Elvis Presley, where the music is produced to him and he goes on stage and takes all the credit. So that's what's happening with African journalists. We do work, we do, sacrifice our own safety to bring stories, but at the end, our names are no longer with our work. So we've become fixers while other journalists from Europe and North America take the credit. There has to be an understanding that this is a professional job and it needs to be protected and it needs to be really embraced more by, not just by the governments of Africa, but by the people of Africa, which, I get all kinds of attacks on social media for the kind of work I do, and my colleagues are no exception. So there has to be an understanding. We need to be protected, and the position has to be protected as well.
Yeah, lots of protection needed for journalists. And unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much to my guests, Nixon, Nompilo, as well as Samuel. Definitely a conversation that we can continue on social media, though. So you're more than welcome to use the hashtag SABC Media Society. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back with you again next week, Sunday. Have yourselves a fabulous week.